distinction between the two of those things, between an MOU versus an actual peace deal?
Great to be with you, Jono. So absolutely, that is an absolutely crucial distinction. What we are talking about here, what the two sides have agreed to so far, is a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, if you'd like, a framework that sort of outlines the next 60 days of this difficult technical talks. The Americans, or President Trump rather, has been very quick at hailing an agreement that will bring peace to the region. He said, sustainable long-term peace. However, the Iranians have been much more cautious. The Iranians have been talking about first step towards a more permanent agreement. And I think it's an important distinction to have here, because yes, this is a great achievement that is, hopefully bringing the region closer to ending the hostilities that started in February. But we have seen over the last few weeks, efforts, mediation efforts to push, towards a ceasefire, sort of fall through at the very end because of minor details or misinterpretations. It is also important here to note that we do not actually have a text for this MOU as of yet. What we know, or what we understand at least, is that we're talking about a two-pager, so a rather, bare bone outline of, an agreement that would hopefully cease hostilities on both sides and also establish, basic outlines to start talks about, the serious, more sensitive, more difficult issues that have to do with Iran's nuclear program.
And you mentioned those as well, those sensitive issues, because the headlines do suggest the war is over, Najla. But I guess if you look at the detail like you're mentioning there's that major question that is still there around Iran's nuclear program, the uranium enrichment, the verification of that as well. So is that the hardest part of the negotiation? Or are we only just beginning now? How long do you think it's going to take? I have asked one of our guests earlier on for their opinion on this as well.
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, we're barely starting the serious work, I think, Jono. It's really important to say that, over the next 60 days, and it's probably going to, be extended over 60 days, but at least this is what we're talking about, all sides are talking about. There are some very serious gaps that need to be, filled and agreed to. Let me, summarize them into four main gaps. The first one has to do with opening the Strait of Hormuz, long-term, medium and long-term. What does that actually mean? The Americans seem to say that, maritime navigation will go back to its pre-war levels, that we're talking about completely free navigation across the strait. The Iranians seem to have a different interpretation. I mean, the Iranians have used language like, Iranian arrangements or Iranian coordination for ships and different nations trying to, send their ships through the strait. This is an important distinction, a massive gap. And if the Iranians were allowed to impose, say, tolls or, negotiate or speak or coordinate with Iranian authorities before ships can cross, that will be a very serious precedent, across the world. I mean, we have a number of these important straits across the world, and that would be a very dangerous precedent. That's one. Second gap has to do with the very high level, highly enriched uranium stockpiles. What is going to happen to that? I mean, the Americans seem to say that the Iranians are sort of, are open to destroying this stockpile. How does that happen? Do the Iranians actually agree on destroying this stockpile? Do we know how much they've got, in terms of this highly enriched uranium? The third gap has to do, obviously, with the sequencing. The Iranians today, in their various state-affiliated media, seem to say that there's not going to be an agreement until the Americans, prove they are committed to lifting part of the sanctions on the 24 billion frozen assets, Iranian frozen assets. I mean, the Americans seem to say that that is not happening until we see Iranian compliance. And it's important to throw our minds back to previous criticism of the JCPOA by President Trump, who completely attacked the Obama administration for giving the Iranians money for what he said was its terrorist network. And of course, he was referring to its proxies around the region and their malign influence in the region. And I think the fourth gap, and the most important and most pressing, has to do with Lebanon. The Iranians, but also the Pakistanis, seem to say that the ceasefire that is included in this MOU that will be signed in Geneva on Friday includes ceasing hostilities on all fronts. The Israelis seem to have a completely different position. I mean, we listened to the IDF statement this morning, and they seem to say that, the IDF's position in Gaza, in Lebanon, up to and beyond the Litani River and in Syria are permanent. This will be a massive challenge for all parties involved, because, the Iranians might use any new attacks, renewed attacks, Israeli attacks on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon as an excuse to resume hostilities or close the Strait of Hormuz again. So, I mean, these four gaps, and we haven't even started talking about the very serious issues of, nuclear nuclear program, missile program, will that be included or not? And Iran's network of proxies around the region. So I think these are very serious issues that, once this agreement has been properly signed on Friday, because, JD Vance, the vice president, has said that it's been digitally signed. Once that has been signed, we're going to see some very serious, very, fraught discussions and difficult negotiations going forward.
Najla, as you mentioned already, Israel are not at the table for this one as well. The G7 leaders are obviously meeting today. I'm sure that this is going to be dominating the agenda, as you'd imagine. But looking beyond Washington, looking beyond Tehran of this, looking at this on a worldwide scale right now, the military posturing that we've seen from America and from Iran in the last couple of months and the diplomacy that's been at play here, not just both of those parties take Israel out of the equation or at play here, but it seems like this is almost an international problem. We're hearing from world leaders around the globe who are discussing this right now at length and discussing those sanctions, which you referenced earlier as well. I guess that just clearly indicates how much of a deep reach this has had in terms of the war and how much it's gone global. Do you think that something like this, even on this 60-day pause, is enough for the entire world to breathe a sigh of relief and say we can move on from this now?
I mean, I think it's fair to say, you go through all the statements that we've heard since yesterday, whether it's from the region that's been, massively affected, whether we're talking about Asian leaders or European leaders or African leaders as well. I mean, the world economy has been upended because of this conflict. The timing is absolutely terrible. We've seen it when it comes to, energy prices. We've seen it when it comes to, terrible consequences when it comes to agriculture, particularly in Africa and Asia. There is definitely, a sigh of relief globally. However, I think there is a very, very, very cautious optimism going in the background here, because everybody seems to understand that this is only the first step to what is meant to be a very lengthy process and what is, a very, very difficult and fraught process. And I think this is what we're going to hear from the leaders in the G7 meeting in Evian-les-Bains in France today and tomorrow and the day after. And I think this will be, very central to these talks. And maybe we will see or hear announcements from particularly the French and the British, who have, offered to send an international force to help demine, for instance, the Strait of Hormuz and help guarantee freedom of navigation to get back some sort of normalcy through that strait. There is also a willingness, particularly from Europe's side, to be more involved in this process. We know that there is there's been a massive sort of a gap between the Americans and their Atlantic allies over this particular war. The Americans seem to be open today to some sort of European involvement, if that means pressuring Iran and sort of helping push this deal forward. However, I do think that people, countries around the world, particularly these leaders who are directly involved, are really worried about what a resumption of hostilities might mean. Everybody seems to also be banking on the influence of local domestic American politics, because if we're looking at the 60 days framework that's meant to start from this Friday going all the way till end of August, early September, that puts us 2 months before the midterm elections in the United States. Therefore, an understanding that the United States does not necessarily want, the war to restart, nor do they want, more sort of negative sort of consequences on their own local economy, domestic economy, or internationally. So I think there is some sort of cautious optimism going on here. However, there is some serious concerns still, underlying this entire process.
Najla Habribi, an impressive amount of information in a short amount of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jono.